This podcast is brought to you by Natural England, presented by Cordelia Spalding, who is the lead advisor for access and engagement of the Hoverton Great Broad Restoration Project.
Hi Ailish. Obviously I understand that somehow some miraculous thing happened in 1994 and worlds collided and allowed you to start the biomanipulation on this broad. Can you give us a bit of the background story?
Yes, so about the time that Essex and Suffolk Water were going through the process of purchasing part of the Trinity Broads, other landowners were interested in selling, which meant that they could purchase the whole 5 lakes. At the same time, there was money available from Natura 2000 to do biomanipulation on a system that wasn't connected with the river. Because although all the Trinity Broads flow through the Muckfleet and down to Stokesby to the River Wall, it's then pumped into the River Bure.
Okay. So
So there's no influx of salt water or eutrophicated water coming up the system. So it meant that it was ideal for that experiment.
fantastic. So what makes up the Trinity Broads?
So there's 5 lakes. There's Ormesby at the north, which is where the water is abstracted for drinking water. Then the next one is Rollesby with Lily, like a bit of an appendix off the side.
Okay.
You then go into Ormesby Little Broad, and then through under another road bridge into Filby Broad, and from there on into the Muckfleet.
Fantastic. So where did you put the initial sort of fish barriers to start this off, and how did that go?
Okay, well the plan was to biomanipulate just Ormesby Broad, and that has been the case. None of the other broads have been biomanipulated. They've had some mud pumping, but not actual sort of fish management. So Ormesby Broad was managed for its fish populations in 94-95, where they removed a large number of small roach and some bream. These were put into Rollesby, so they didn't leave the system. I think a small number went to the River Bure to restock where there'd been a saline water fish kill, but most of them came back into the Trinities anyway. They then put some rock-filled gabions under Rollesby Bridge to stop those fish then coming back up into Ormesby Broad.
Okay.
So that was the biomanipulation, and within 4 months it was crystal clear water. The water was full of water fleas.
Wow.
And since then we've been mapping the return of the aquatic plants.
That's quite amazing that happened so quickly, isn't it?
It is, it's incredible. Nature just needs a little sort of shove in the right direction sometimes to undo the damage that we've done.
So, Scott, I know that obviously there's plans to do some amazing biomanipulation on the Hoverton Great Broad. Why are you out here today? Are you just enjoying the sunshine, or what's the aim?
I'm out here today to talk to Ailish about the biomanipulation that Norfolk Wildlife Trust have been involved in, understand any issues they had, any lessons learnt from their biomanipulation, the way the system recovered, how quickly those macrophytes, that's the aquatic plants, came back, and really to sort of see if there's anything that was done here that I can take away and apply to what we're doing on Hoverton Great Broad.
So is it that the plants are really the key mechanism here that will make things, suddenly turn beautifully clear?
No, so the mechanism is by removing the fish, you remove the predation pressure on the water fleas. That allows your water flea population to grow, and they will graze on the algae that are in the water. It's the algae that have grown from the eutrophication of the system and have made the water murky, and the aquatic plants haven't been able to get the sunlight they need and have died off. By creating that clear water, when you graze off the algae with the water fleas, then those plants can come back, they get the sunlight they need, and once they're there, you're creating great habitat for the invertebrates and the fish to restore the system.
So really we want sort of herds of water fleas, a bit like underwater cows.
Yeah, exactly.
To do the job.
And then
Okay.
once you've got that diverse and stable population of aquatic plants, you're creating sort of a healthy natural system that is able to buffer itself against the kind of inputs that are coming from the system, hopefully create areas for those water fleas to hide so that the predation pressure isn't as much, and you then can get a new fish population in there which is more diverse. There's more sort of niches within that habitat for those different fish species to occupy.
Okay. Ailish, I noticed that you said that there are quite a lot of small roach. Was that the predominant species in these water systems here?
Well, when you get the eutrophicated water systems, so you have all this murky, algae-filled water, virtually no plants, very few water fleas or other small crustaceans or other small invertebrates. So you end up with a huge number of small fish that can never get enough food to get bigger.
Okay.
You will then maybe have a small number of top predators like pike, that they probably aren't getting enough food because there aren't enough big fish for them. So you have this really unhealthy but very stable system. Once you let the light into the plants, as Scott was saying, you then get refuges for the water fleas, you create more habitat. It also means that then you've got some fish that can get larger. And we've also encouraged some perch into the system as well. So they're predators on some of the smaller roach. So we're creating a system whereby you can have lots of different age classes of fish, as well as a more variety of species. And one thing that we have noticed is that the pike fishery has improved immensely. So we're getting more pike, we're getting bigger pike, and a lot of the angling that's done here now is for pike.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know a lot of fishermen would be very happy about giant pike. So is the makeup of the fish in the Hoverton Great Broad the same as here, or is it different?
No, broadly it is the same. The Bure in general has suffered, like the rest of the Broads, from the same history of eutrophication for a really long time, you know.
And, sorry, Scott, I'm just going to interrupt you because this word eutrophication, I know you sciencey types all know what you're talking about, but for us poor lay souls, is that the process that you're talking about where it becomes very murky, this sort of abundance of rubbish in the water, basically?
Yeah, so essentially what it is, it's things like sewage and fertilisers running off, sewage from sewage treatment works and fertiliser from farmland running off. And it's fertilising the water. That's exactly what it's doing. And that allows these algal numbers to bloom. Like, you know, these are sort of essentially single-celled plants. And by putting lots of nutrients into the water, you're giving them lots of food to grow, essentially. And they will explode in numbers. And that results in very murky water, green, dark, murky water. They will then also, where they have these population explosions, they will die off, and that creates a lot of dead material in the system, as well as dead plant material where the plants have died, and you'll get rapid silt build up as well. And because these are very small organisms, you get very fine silt that again is not very good for the aquatic plants to root into. It's often why, preceding any biomanipulation, we do sediment removal. It's to remove that sediment that has lots of nutrients in it because it's caught the nutrients that were in the system, and it's very fine and not very good for the aquatic plant.
Yeah,
and it's very shallow.
I have seen some of this weird sort of silt build up because I presume it's the cellulose in the plants. It's got a really sort of viscous, slightly stickiness to it, even though it looks like mud. It doesn't feel quite
mud,
does it?
It's very, very fine because it's made up of very fine materials. There isn't a lot of organic matter in there, really, to kind of make it a bit firmer.
Okay.
It's also the case that there will be phosphorus, which is a nutrient, held within that silt, which then bream can actually cause the release of, because they're bottom-feeding creatures, so they'll be swimming about and feeding in that area, stirring up all the sediment and helping to re-release phosphorus back in. So there's more nutrients going back in all the time. And it's also tied in with sort of looking for things like little midge larvae, and the activity of the midge larvae can cause the release of the phosphorus as well. So you've just got a whole system that's turning in on itself all the time, and you need to break that cycle.
Sounds like a perfect sort of never-ending circle of viciousness in terms of these things, just one generating the other. Yeah. Fantastic. So let's head a bit further down the Broad and see what other things we've got in store. So we've just come to stop in the middle of which broad are we in now?
Ormesby Little.
We're in Ormesby Little. It doesn't look that little to me. And we've just been chatting as we go along. We have to stop because otherwise the motor is so noisy. It's electric and very good for the environment, but very noisy on the ear. And we're going to talk about, we've just been chatting really about how both roach and bream sort of contribute sometimes to this eutrophication. Am I saying that right? I'll let you guys put it right if I'm wrong. Ailish, what's your view on that?
Well, yes, I mean, the culprit really is the nutrients that are coming into the system. But once they come into effect, they cause the fish populations to be out of balance. So you do end up with this huge number of very small fish, a lot of roach, very small roach, and then a few larger fish. So then the whole system tends to sustain itself in that poor quality. So the small roach will be eating the water fleas, so they can't control the algae. The bream will be disturbing the bottom, which will release more nutrients back into the water, so then you get more algal blooms. So there are key things that can happen, so you need to try and reduce or stop the amount of nutrients coming into the system. You can then do some mud pumping, which can remove some of the existing horrible silt that we talked about earlier that releases more nutrients back in. But ultimately you need to have something to kick-start the growth of the plants. So they can't grow if they've got no light. So we need to get the water clearer, and the water fleas are vital to do that. So what we need to do is take away from the system the things that eat all the water fleas, which is mainly the small roach, and also some of the large bream that will stir up the bottom. And the interesting thing on the Trinity Broads is that although we only biomanipulated Ormesby Broad and separated that off with a fish barrier, pretty much all the fish went into the rest of the system. So the whole system didn't really reduce the number of fish artificially. But the changes in water quality we got in Ormesby then seemed to trickle through to the whole system. And so now for 9 to 10 months of the year, we have clear water conditions throughout all the 5 lakes, and we have healthy fish populations, healthy plant populations, lots of birds. It's just wonderful.
So it seems to me that this biomanipulation seems like a really effective way to break the cycle and get rid of this sort of murky water scenario that we have, allowing the smaller fish to grow, because it seems like you've got swathes of small fish that maybe aren't reaching their maturity.
Yeah, I think that's the case on Trinity Broads. On Hoverton Great Broad, it's slightly different. There are some large fish. It's connected to the river, so there are large bream within Hoverton and some larger other fish. However, the habitat is impoverished, and so there is a lack of food supply. In the current murky conditions, you have lots of water fleas. We call them zooplankton, but they're very small varieties. When you remove the fish and you remove the predation pressure, it allows the larger zooplankton to come into the community to flourish. And then once you get the macrophytes back, it gives them niches that they can hide in, so you maintain those larger zooplankton, which are a better food source. You also will get invertebrates related to those aquatic plants, which again is another food source for the fish. So you have this more diverse fish community because there's more sort of food groups for them to feed on, but equally there are opportunities for fish to grow to these larger sizes.
It's amazing to think how much difference this biomanipulation makes. Scott, when you think about Hoverton, what do you think?
Yeah, well, we're in a very similar situation with Hoverton, that's in this degraded state, but we now know that the water quality is improved to the point where we can make a difference. The sewage treatment works have introduced a stripping process where they remove the nutrients from the sewage before they release that water into the river. Anglian Water have done a lot of work to reduce the amount they're coming off their sewage treatment.
Obviously, the project at Hoverton Great Broad is an amazing opportunity. How do you feel being the officer who's going to make this all happen?
I feel really excited, actually. We've just been sitting here on Little Ormesby, and we've taken thrown a rake in to get out some aquatic plants, and I'm looking at the holly-leaved naiad and the fennel-leaved pondweed. And these are plants that we just don't have on the Hobbiton. You know, we've got 4 species, I think. Most of it is bare mud. It's a bit of a sort of underwater desert, to be honest. And the idea that in a few years' time we'll be able to see these species effectively reversing what has been over 60 years of decline. We know from sampling the sediment, you can see the remains of these plants in the sediment from over 60 years ago. They were there, and unfortunately human activity has seen those disappear. And I think it's quite easy to overlook that. When you're on the Broads, you have this green water, you can't see the beds of these lakes, and you can't see the ecological damage that has been happened to them. Someone who was going on the Broads in the 1920s would have had crystal clear water. They would have seen this range of plants. They would have seen large pike, perch, tench, rudd swimming through these aquatic plants, and they would have had a real connection with that aquatic environment, and that doesn't exist anymore. And the idea that we can recreate that, we can restore the Broads to their former glory, these are meant to be one of the jewels in our crown in the country. And I think there's sort of, because you can't see it, there's a lack of understanding there of the kind of difficult position they're in.
I agree. The fact that, unfortunately, because the water is so murky now, we have lost that connection. I mean, if that underwater safari sort of Sahara was above ground, I'm sure we'd all have a very different feel and you know, connection with wanting to put it right. Because at the moment, it's something that, because we can't, you know, visibly penetrate it in terms of seeing what lies beyond, we just don't necessarily make as much as we could of taking care of it.
It's a really interesting example is that I was reading about how they don't want people to stop feeding swans because there's insufficient plants in the water bodies in Britain to sustain the swans, so they were starving to death. We get 150, 250 swans on here in the summer because we've got so much plant food for them. That's how the system should work. So we can all see swans, but we need to understand that what they rely on is that kind of underwater forest.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say I'm quite looking forward to the trip back across the Broad here. It's beautifully sunny, blue skies reflecting on the water, and I really look forward to seeing Hobbiton, hopefully with its crystal clear waters and beautiful plants underneath. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by Natural England. If you'd like to find out more about the restoration project going on at Hobbiton Great Broad, you can visit the Hobbiton Great Broad website, which is hobbitongreatbroad.org.uk. Thank you for listening.